began in Europe, but some of its deepest economic consequences appeared thousands of kilometers away. In Egypt, bread prices surged. In Nigeria, fertilizer costs climbed beyond the reach of many farmers. Across parts of East Africa, already fragile food systems faced even greater pressure. Officially, food and fertilizer were never meant to be targets. But global finance is rarely that simple, because when sanctions reshape banking systems, shipping routes, and international insurance markets, the shockwaves do not stop at national borders. They travel through ports, through supply chains, through currencies, and eventually into the daily lives of millions of ordinary people. This is the story of how one of the largest sanctions campaigns in modern history created consequences far beyond its original target, and why Africa may be paying a far higher price than many expected. Since 2022, sweeping sanctions imposed on Russia by Western powers have reshaped global trade. Restrictions targeted banking systems, energy exports, shipping access, technology imports, and financial transactions. Although food and fertilizer exports were technically exempt from many sanctions, international trade systems became far more cautious. Global banks, insurers, and shipping firms often avoided Russian-linked transactions entirely, fearing regulatory penalties or reputational risks. Economists call this phenomenon over-compliance. For Africa, the timing could not have been worse. Before the conflict, many African nations relied heavily on wheat, fertilizer, and agricultural chemicals from the Black Sea region. Countries like Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, and Tunisia imported substantial quantities of grain and farming inputs connected to Russian and Ukrainian supply chains. For years, Ibrahim used fertilizer to maintain stable harvests. Then prices nearly doubled. The cost of keeping his farm alive suddenly depended on geopolitical decisions made thousands of kilometers away. Can African economies survive global economic wars they did not create? Higher fertilizer prices mean lower crop yields. Lower crop yields mean more expensive food. And more expensive food pushes millions closer to insecurity. In Cairo, governments struggled to maintain bread subsidy programs. In East Africa, food import bills climbed sharply. Across multiple African economies, inflation became more than an economic statistic. It became a daily reality. As sanctions intensified, global trade routes became increasingly unstable. Banks hesitated, shipping firms reduced exposure. Insurance premiums rose sharply across key maritime corridors. Even legal transactions became slower, more expensive, and more difficult to process. Several agricultural agencies warned of major declines in fertilizer accessibility across parts of Africa during the early stages of the disruption. Some farming cooperatives reported that smaller farmers reduced acreage or switched to lower-yield crops because fertilizer had become too expensive. At the same time, Russia gradually redirected portions of its energy and commodity exports toward alternative markets in Asia, particularly China and India. But smaller African economies lacked the same bargaining power. The deeper problem was not only the sanctions themselves, it was the structure of the global financial system surrounding them. Much international coverage focused on the direct confrontation between Russia and the West, but the secondary economic consequences for developing regions often received far less attention. The barrier was often invisible. Not a direct ban, but a financial environment that made ordinary trade increasingly difficult. For millions of Africans, the crisis was never about diplomacy. It was about affordability, about food, about survival. Higher food inflation, reduced agricultural productivity, increased debt pressure on governments, greater dependence on external markets. The crisis exposed a difficult reality. Africa remains deeply vulnerable to geopolitical decisions made elsewhere. Yet this story is not only about vulnerability. Across the continent, governments and financial institutions have started exploring alternatives. Regional payment systems, local fertilizer production, cross-border industrial partnerships, and efforts to reduce dependency on distant supply chains. Bodies like the African Union, ECOWAS, and regional development banks have increasingly emphasized economic resilience and strategic self-reliance. But the path forward remains difficult. Infrastructure gaps, debt burdens, and fragmented trade systems continue to slow progress. The sanctions campaign against Russia may have reshaped global politics, but it also revealed something deeper. In a deeply interconnected world, economic pressure rarely stays contained. If this video opened your eyes, if you're sitting there thinking, why did I never learn this? Why does mainstream media not cover this? Why isn't this the most important story in the world right now? Then subscribe to the African Mail, because we are here to do exactly that. To decode the stories that powerful interests prefer you don't understand. To cover Africa not as a continent of problems, but as the central arena of 21st century geopolitics, economics, and human possibility. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and if you know someone who needs to see this, share it. The truth doesn't spread itself.